Namaste. Professor Gayacharan Tripathi ji, Director, Bhogilal Leherchand Institute of Indology, New Delhi, who is a reputed Indologist and distinguished Sanskritist. In fact, he received President of India certification on his work that he has done to Sanskrit literature and language. Dr. Gitesh Nirban, co-convener of the webinar series. Dear viewers interested in Mahabharata scholarship, I welcome you all to our webinar series on Mahabharata initiated under the project Yoga Consciousness in Mahabharata and Bhagavad Gita, the ethical value of societal and political well-being, which was taken up under the scheme for promotion of academic research and collaboration under Ministry of Human Resource Development, Government of India. Our team includes Professor Vishwa Adluri, Professor of Philosophy, Hunter College, USA, Dr. Joydeep Bagchi from Hindu University of America, Dr. Gitesh Nirban, Kamala Nehru College, Delhi University, Delhi, Professor Balaganapati, it's me, heading the Department of Philosophy, Delhi University, and we are supported by a young team, Ms. Jayashree, Ms. Anmol, both of them are research fellows of the project, Ms. Deepshika and Ms. Megha, who are part of our extended team. The project aims to build a new approach to yoga that combines theoretical and practical perspectives, and it also aims to understand yoga beyond a set of postures as an overarching term for salvic practices, and to see how it is embedded in social and political reality. It also aims to reappropriate texts of classical Hinduism which have suffered from Oriental approaches in order to articulate the vision of yoga consciousness. It aims further to demonstrate how answers to question of right action at societal and political levels can be explored through the conception of yoga consciousness in Mahabharata and Bhagavad Gita that transcends sectarian and doctrinal boundaries to create a global system of thought and practice. To explicate, it also aims to explicate the universal, philanthropic, and humanitarian aspects of Hinduism as echoed in Mahabharata and Bhagavad Gita. The specified pointers of this project are yoga consciousness in Mahabharata and Bhagavad Gita, ethical values of societal well-being, ethical values of political well-being. So far, we had lectures on yoga consciousness, the first pointer, and then also on social well-being. Today, the talk will delve into the political well-being and state administration in Mahabharata. We are fortunate to have with us Professor Gayacharan Tripathi ji. In spite of his slight ill health, he could join us to talk to us and help us in understanding the political well-being and state administration as it is envisaged in Mahabharata, text Mahabharata. The questions that come into the mind when we try to look at political well-being are this sort. What is polity? How do we understand this polity? And is it the king or some other mechanism beyond? When we try to understand political well-being, the first and foremost thing that is to be clarified is what is polity according to us, or how do we see polity, the concept of polity. Is it the king who is seen to be encompassing the polity, or is it some mechanism, or is it the people? And insights, we would also get insights into the state administration through this lecture. And what is more important is how do we conceptualize political well-being itself? Okay, conceptualizing polity is different, and conceptualizing political well-being is slightly broader and a comprehensive one. Looking into it through Mahabharata, conceptualizing it through Mahabharata is the endeavor that we are taking up in this today's lecture. So without wasting much time, I request Dr. Geetesh to introduce Professor G.C. Tripathi ji to the audience. Over to you, Dr. Geetesh.
Thank you, Professor Bala. Namaskar to all of you. Before I go ahead with the introduction of our esteemed speaker for the day, I would like to request all our participants to keep their audios muted and the videos off so that we can have a seamless flow of today's session also. All participants are requested to send their questions in the chat box during as well as after the session so that we can have a very interesting and engaging Q&A. And I would be again requesting you at the end of the session to switch on your videos to have a group photograph. Thank you all the participants for being with us in all the sessions. We are here today with an esteemed scholar, a reputed scholar with the name Professor G.C. Tripathi, who is well known and widely reputed Indologist and Sanskrit scholar, trained both in the traditional Indian and Western ways. He was awarded the highest certificate of honor as modern Sanskrit scholar by the President of India, Dr. APJ Abdul Kalam, in 2005. He has honors from various Indological institutions and Sanskrit academies, including Delhi Sanskrit Academy, UP Sanskrit Academy, Bihar Rashtrabhasha Parishad, Ved Vidya Pratishthan, Ujjain, Rashtriya Sanskrit Sansthan. The Hindi Sahitya Sammelan conferred upon him the title of Maha Mahopadhyay, and recently he has been awarded Meera Smriti Samman at Allahabad. Born in Agra, 1939, Professor Tripathi pursued his master's and acharya from Sanskrit University. He has his PhD on Vedic deities and their subsequent development through Itihasa and Puranas, as conducted on a research fellowship in humanities of the Ministry of Education, Agra, in 1962. He was a postdoctoral fellow of German Academic Exchange Service to the University of Freiburg in 1962 to 1967, and Doctor of Philosophy from University of Freiburg too. Professor Tripathi is trained in the disciplines of manuscriptology and in the principles of textual criticism of the Leipzig School of Indology. Professor Tripathi has served for 43 years as director and professor in research institutes and several universities. Presently, he's a director at BL Institute of Indology, Delhi since July 2012. He has been a national fellow at the Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, Shimla, professor and head of Kalakosh Division, Research and Publication Wing of Indira Gandhi National Center for Arts, New Delhi. He has also served as principal or director of Sir Ganganath Jha Research Institute. He has been the visiting professor at the universities of Tübingen and Heidelberg in 1985, a visiting noted scholar at University of British Columbia, Mercator Professor of German Research Council at the Freie University of Berlin, Professor and Chairperson of the Oriental Institute of University at Leipzig. Also, Shiv Dasani Professor at Oxford Center for Hindu Studies. He's been at University of Oxford as well as the ICCR Professor to the University of Marburg. Prior to 1977, he was Senior Research Fellow at South Asia Institute, Heidelberg, Assistant Professor at University of Freiburg, and Lecturer at Universities of Udaipur and Aligarh. He's the author of 9 books, has edited 22 Sanskrit texts, and published 120 research papers in Indian and foreign journals on subjects ranging from Vedic and Puranic mythology, Sanskrit literature, art and architecture, ritual and philosophy of the temples in Orissa, ancient history, epigraphy, ritual, Indian philosophy, Sanskrit literature, textual criticism, and many more. The list is very long here. Sir is well versed in the knowledge of English, German, French, and Latin, and we all know he's a Sanskritist. What an honor for us at the Spark platform to have a scholar of this distinction and repute. Thank you, sir, for being with us. Thank you for sparing time in spite of not keeping that well yesterday. We have Professor Tripathi, who will be delivering an address on political well-being and state administration as reflected in Mahabharata. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Giteshji, for such very kind words. I am very thankful to you. Also to Professor Devarakonda, who has kindly invited me to deliver this talk. Well, I extend a cordial greetings and hearty welcome to all ladies and gentlemen connected with us in this academic program. The Mahabharata, as you must have already realized by now, is a veritable encyclopedia of our cultural heritage, the widest sense of the term. Ancient India, in almost all its aspects, is amply reflected in it. It's one of our most prominent literary sources to know about our own ancient social structure and customs, political setup, daily life of the people, different schools of philosophical thought, as well as religious practices. It has rightly been claimed by our Pandits that that which is not mentioned or indicated in the Mahabharata was not existent in India at all in ancient times. Yan Nabharate, Tan Nabharate. My paper today shall be limited on elucidating Raj Dharmas. Raj Dharmas, that is the rights and duties, first duties and rights of a king. And I have culled the matter from the Shanti Parva, only from the Shanti Parva of the Mahabharata. But don't think that that Shanti Parva, since the matter is only from Shanti Parva, so it would be only a very small sort of say mention of say Raj Dharmas, because there are 70 chapters in Shanti Parva are dedicated to this theme, only to this theme. 50 chapters are dedicated to removing the, say, depression and of Yudhishthir, in which he has sunk into depression because of the feeling of guilt that he has killed his near and dear relatives and even his preceptors, gurus, and even his the people whom he should have rather venerated. And 50 and 70 chapters are dedicated to Raj Dharma alone. So I could not curtail the matter which is spread in these 50 chapters, because that would have been too long a paper, and because of the limitation of time, I have taken up only the relevant matter dealing with this subject. It is said that the main idea of Maharshi Vyas behind composing the Mahabharata was to explain the meaning and the relevance of dharma in every sphere of human life. When you go through the Mahabharata, you know well what is dharma and what is adharma. Just as in today's society also, in the ancient times as well, there were some people who did not follow the path of dharma. They either went the wrong way or pursued, or were more concerned about the other three purusharthas. Purusharthas are the goals of life, purposes of life, artha, kama, and moksha, leaving aside dharma. You know the meaning, approximately the meaning of artha, kama, and moksha. Artha is wealth, that is collecting money for the family, or amassing wealth even. Kama is pursuit of pleasures, and moksha is final release or salvation. But Vyasa is of the opinion that dharma is not only the first but also the foremost. If you follow the path of dharma and you stick to it, you will automatically achieve the other three goals of life as well. He is disappointed and sorry to note that in spite of that, the people do not adhere to the path of dharma. Towards the end of the Mahabharata, he wails and appears to be almost in tears when he says, "I cry out loudly, stick only to your own dharma, people. You shall achieve artha and kama as well through it. But unfortunately, no one is prepared to listen to me. Urdhva bahur giraumyesha naiva kaschit shrunoti me. Dharmat arthascha kamascha sadharma kim na sevyate." Why don't you follow the path of dharma? Why don't you pursue dharma? Because you will get your artha and kama as well through dharma, and even moksha thereafter. But what is this dharma to which he attaches such an importance? It is not religion as it is commonly translated today. The simple and most apt definition of dharma as given by Manu is dharanat dharmamityahu dharmo dharayate praja. Those rules, practices, precepts, and conduct which sustains a society, keeps it together, let the people live harmoniously with each other, is dharma. The word is derived from the root dri, which means to sustain, to hold together. There are certain universal dharmas like non-violence, compassion, truthfulness, not coveting the property of others, honesty in dealing with each other. But there are individual dharmas as well, the swadharmas, everyone's own duties towards family, society, and the country. These dharmas vary according to one's age, position, or status in the society. So the person who is coronated as the king of a land has also certain duties towards his people, which are called Rajadharmas. How a king has to behave, how he has to treat his subject, how he should protect them from enemies, how should he ensure their supply of food, and finally, how should he uproot evil by destroying evildoers in the society. These are all this fall under his right and duty. There is only one word for right and duty in Sanskrit. Did you know? It is adhikara. Adhikara means duty and adhikara means also right. So the duty of someone is the right of the other. So there is only one word, adhikara, and this means both duty as well as right. Let me mention here a very important point which highlights the radical difference in the relationship between a king and the people living in his kingdom, as it was conceived in ancient India, vis-a-vis as it was envisaged in the Western world. The Sanskrit word for common people living in the territory of a king is praja, which means offspring, children, progeny. The root is jan. Jan means to create or to give birth to. The act of king is known as prajapalan. Palana means to nurture, to nourish, and also to protect. In European parlance, common people are subject of a king. Now look at the etymology of the word. It is of Latin origin. In Latin, sub, pronounced as sub in English, means down, below. And ject, originally jectus, because this pronunciation of ya as ja became prevalent in the Roman Empire only in 3rd century. So this ject comes from the root or from the verb yakare. Yakare, which means, yakare means to throw. The word subjectus, English subject, is therefore a person who has been thrown down by someone who is mightier than him. A downtrodden, one who can even be trampled upon at will. The Romans used this word for the people of the country whom they had conquered and over whom they had absolute right and control. They did not nourish, nurture, or protect these people as their own children, which is meant in Sanskrit with the expression prajapalanam, but instead they ruled and governed them. They ruled over them, commanded them, and exploited them at their will. What a tremendous difference in the basic concepts of the relationship between the king and his people in our and their cultures. A number of Sanskrit poets have elucidated this cordial relationship, even though it was just an ideal, between the Raja and Praja in their works. In his drama Shakuntala, Kalidas once mentions King Dushyanta taking rest after having heard patiently and solved the problems of his people as if they were his own children. He showered ample love and care upon them. Praja swa iva chintayitva nishevate shantamana viviktim. In another verse, he declares in his kingdom that if anybody suffers the bereavement of a near and dear one in his family, let him not mourn, because the king is there to fulfill that gap. Yen vyujyante prajas nigdhen bandhuna sasapapa drite raja dushyant iti bhushyata. Another famous poet, Bhavabhuti, in his drama Uttar Ramacharitam, lets Lord Rama declare, for the sake of my people, I am prepared to give up my love, my compassion, my own comforts and pleasures Yet, even to the extent of deserting my beloved wife Janaki, if it pleases my people. And these are not empty words, as the coming events prove it. As far as Yudhishthir is concerned, we do not hear any such statement in the beginning of the description of the Rajadharmas in the Mahabharata, because he is still a greenhorn. He has no experience of ruling a kingdom, because he, along with his 4 younger brothers and wife, have spent most of their time away from the center of power, wandering about in Varanavat and other forests. In fact, he is depicted as sunk in deep depression and tormented by a feeling of guilt for killing his close relatives and brothers. He cannot get rid of the feeling of guilt for killing his own maternal uncle Shalya and for being instrumental and helpful in killing those highly respectable personalities who were and ought to be the object of his veneration. All Pandavas, one by one, wife Draupadi, and ultimately Krishna, try to take him out of this state of despondency with great difficulty. Of course, for which the author of the Mahabharata has to devote not less than 50 chapters. And then he agrees reluctantly, rather reluctantly, to get coronated as king of Hastinapur. But he is well aware of the fact that he cannot be a successful ruler, because to rule is not a part of his nature, and he is totally inexperienced in the matters of statecraft. Advice is sought from Krishna as usual, who rightly advises him to go to his own grandsire Bhishma, who is still alive, with his body resting prostrate on a structure of arrows built by Arjuna. It is natural that he should seek the help of his Pitamaha Bhishma, because it is he who has the longest experience of being associated with the affairs of the state. Even though he was not a crowned king, yet everyone knows that neither Vichitravirya, the father of Dhritarashtra, nor the blind Dhritarashtra never took any major decision without his advice, the advice of Bhishma. It was he, one can say, who was ruling from behind, while his stepbrother and his son Dhritarashtra were on thrones. Immediately after his coronation and before going to Bhishma, he orders everyone, his brothers as well as the servants of the palace, to treat Dhritarashtra and Gandhari with the same respect and the same royal dignity which these two have been enjoying till now. He had also done the same after first entering into Hastinapur. Went to him, he bowed at his feet and begged excuse for what had happened till then. I shall not go into detail of the meeting between the group of the Pandavas along with Krishna and Bhishma. When upon the request of Krishna, Bhishma agrees to preach the duties of a king and the basic principles of governing a state, that is the science of statecraft, Yudhishthir is first very shy to face Bhishma because of the guilt of the ills committed in war. But when Bhishma assures him that he has done nothing wrong and it is incumbent upon a Kshatriya, it is his swadharma to fight for his right and to destroy his enemies, he is quasi-reassured. He approaches Bhishma like an obedient and respectful son and grasps his hands. grasped with his hands the feet of Bhishma. Bhishma asks him to start his questions, whereupon he bows to all elders and starts putting his questions to Bhishma. His first query is that the Raj Dharma, the duties and responsibilities of the king towards his subject, is eulogized in the best and the highest, is eulogized or praised as the best and the highest of all dharmas, but he considered it as a great burden, Mahantam Bharam, and also very complex and complicated to understand. Bhishma explains that all the three worldly Purusharthas, Dharma, Artha and Kama, are included in the Raj Dharma, and it is ultimately also the source of final liberation, moksha, for a king if this Dharma is carried out properly. It is the Raj Dharma which holds the setup of a society together, lets everybody earn his livelihood properly through the duties assigned to him, and to live peacefully and comfortably, also contented. If Raj Dharmas are not followed properly, chaotic conditions shall prevail in the society and the state would be totally disintegrated. A king is called Rajan because he keeps his subject happy and pleased. Because of Ranjanam, he does the Ranjanam of his praja. Bhishma first defines what a state is according to him. The state or the Rajyam consists of 7 elements or 7 entities, and they are the king, Swami, his ministers, Amatya, his treasury, Kosha, his army, Balam, his allies, Mitram or friendly states, his fort, Durgam, and last but not least, the common people themselves, the praja, his praja or the rashtram. These 7, all these 7 taken together form a state. Swamyamatyascha rashtram cha durgam kosho balam suhrit parasparopakaridam saptangam rajya muchyate. When all these 7 function in perfect unison with each other, the state is strong. Weakness, any one of them, leads to the ultimate destruction of the state. The first and the foremost rule to follow by a king is to remain alert and active all the time. Many kings who ignore their duties and get engrossed in pleasures and luxuries, ignoring the welfare of their state, destroy themselves sooner or later. It is suicidal for them. Either they are attacked and killed by the kings of the neighboring countries who are ever prepared to grab his land, to annex it to their own, or they become a puppet in the hands of their courtiers. The kings who are truthful, true to their words and promises, meritorious, with good character, soft-spoken, with a smiling face, master of their sense organs, self-controlled and generous, are never displaced from their throne. Yudhishthir, be always soft, simple, and straightforward towards your subject, but protect your secrets well. Never be so lax and uncareful, careless that your plans and your weaknesses become public and the people or your enemies take advantage of that. Wield your authority properly, but not with an iron rod. Be soft, but not so soft that your people start undermining you and ignoring your orders. At the time of the coronation, the Brahminic priests infuse the king with the tejas. Tejas is the brilliance and splendor, which simply means power, of 8 gods. I'm sorry, 5 gods and 8 Dikpalas. And these 5 main gods whose power the king inherits are fire, Agni, Surya, sun, Kuber, Yama, and Mrityu. He acts as Agni, destroying or burning down the wicked elements and evil in the society. With his well-managed system of intelligence, he comes to know what is happening in the remotest corner of his kingdom, even though it is not above for other people. In this way, he is like Surya, because the light of Surya illuminates every corner of this earth. He knows exactly what the people think about him and what they are planning to do if dissatisfied. This is the aspect of sun in him. For distributing his wealth liberally among the destitutes and the needy, he is said to possess the aspect of Kubera, the treasurer of God. For maintaining law and order in the society, for awarding and punishing the people according to their karmas. He is equated with Yama, and finally, he assumes the form of death in the battle when his enemies invade his kingdom and attack his people. Bhishma stresses at many places that in a state where the king is weak and inactive, the more powerful and mighty citizens harass and even destroy the weaker section. A Matsya Nyaya, the law, Matsya Nyaya, the law of fish law prevailing in the swarm of fish in the ocean, where bigger fish eats up the smaller fish, prevails. At another place in a similar vein, he says that if a king does not harshly punish the culprits who commit heinous crimes against the society, then the mightier would cook and eat up the weak, piercing their body with a pike and grilling them on fire as they do it with fishes. Dandam chet dandayen naiva raja kruram atandrita shule matsyan ivapakshan durbalam balavattara. A Kshatriya wields weapon so that from nowhere emerges the heart-rending, wailing cry of an oppressed person, please, please come and help me. Kshatriya dharjate shastram narth shabdo bhavediti. Further, a king should try to protect the social order of the 4 varnas and the 4 ashramas, which has been established long ago by ancient kings like Manu and approved by sages. The royal authority is bestowed upon the kings by the religious authority represented by the Brahmins through the ritual of Rajyabhishek and the sacrifices like Rajasuya. Bhishma quotes in this regard two ancient verses which Yudhishthir is advised to keep well in his mind. Fire emerges from water. The origin of iron is a stone, and the power of a Kshatriya is derived from the religious authority wielded by Brahmins. The inherent tejas, glow, power, for these three, namely fire, iron, and a Kshatriya, gets extinguished when they try to fight against their source, their own origin. Fire gets extinguished when it tries to burn water. An object fashioned with iron or a weapon like a sword or an axe, when struck against a stone, gets blunt. And a Kshatriya suffers a lot and loses his authority when it starts tormenting the Brahmins. Adbhognir brahmana kshatram ashmo lohamuthitam tesham sarvatragam teja swasu yonishu shamyati ayohanti yadashmanam agnina varihanyate brahmacha kshatriyo dveshti tada sidanti tetraya. The concept of royal authority being subservient to the highest religious authority reminds us of the similar political situation in the medieval ages of Europe, when the Pope in Vatican had absolute power to recognize or de-recognize a king, and even to dethrone a king if he acts against the religious interests of the Pope or of Christianity. Brahmins should be exempted from paying tax because it is believed that 1/6 of all the religious rites that they perform accrues to the king. It goes to the king, who creates to the king who creates favorable situation and circumstances for them to perform penance and religious practices. But in case of emergency, when the security of the state is threatened by an external enemy and the king has to raise an army to fight his foe, taxing of Brahmins or even taking away their property is fully justified. It is also allowed to kill a Brahmin if he allies with the enemy of the king or passes on the secrets of the state to the enemy. In other normal crimes, he is simply banished from the state, but not killed. Bhishma advises Yudhishthir neither to be too rigid nor to be too soft dealing with his subject, especially his courtiers, those commoners with whom he comes into contact. If he is too lenient and liberal towards his servants, the servants take advantage of his softness. They have little respect towards him, and they start using kings' own personal effects like horse, elephants, and chariots, etc., for their own use, and sometimes eat even a portion of the food cooked for the king. They divulge the secret of the kings to the outsiders and carelessly perform the duties assigned to them. Sometimes they behave improperly, even in front of the king, or even having befriended the guards of the harem, they enter into that space forbidden for everyone except the king. They become so audacious that they cut jokes with the king and develop even courage to pass such remarks as, "In this or that matter, Your Highness has not done well, your decision was wrong, and you should have acted in a different manner in such and such way." The king should therefore neither be too strict towards his men nor too soft. He should be like the season of spring, Vasanta Ritu, neither too hot nor too mild or too cold. The king should repose absolutely, the king should not repose absolute trust in anybody. He should double check the working of all his servants sent on different errands, especially for knowing the vulnerable secrets of his adversaries. It is the duty of the king to provide for the sustenance of the widows and the destitutes who have no one to support them. He should make sure by periodical checkings that his food, clothes, and other articles that he sends for the poor population of his kingdom really reach them and do not disappear midway. In order to protect the kingdom from enemies, Bhishma advises Yudhishthir to construct strong forts with a ditch filled up with water around to keep crocodiles and water snakes, etc. in it. Inside the fort, there should be provision of food for many months and also dispensaries, that is medical aid, where injured could be treated. There is a long list in chapter 69 of Mahabharata, of this Parva, which are to be collected and kept ready for any emergency in a fort. The 6 ways to deal, they are called gunas, the 6 ways to deal with the enemy in case of a possible war or any impending peril on the state are known as Shadgurnya. They are dealt with at some length in the Mahabharata. They are called Sandhi, Vigraha, Yan, Asan, Sanshray, and Dvaidhi Bhav. To avoid war by making peace, I elucidate these technical words. To avoid war by making, Sandhi is to avoid war by making peace with the enemy. Vigraha is to sever all relations with that state or the king. Yana is to invade the enemy territory. Asan is simply to keep quiet, making preparations for the war and remaining alert, but also not undertaking anything. In Sanshay means to take that in case of attack, close all the city gates and to retreat in an impenetrable fort with army. And finally, Dvaidhi Bhav means try to create discord in the army of the enemy by spreading false rumors or winning over a few important officers of the adversary by showering favors on them secretly. In other words, by bribing them. According to Bhishma, the king who knows exactly which recourse he has to follow, at which time, at which which kind of time and situation he enjoys his kingdom for long. Shad Gurnyam Vedti Samyak Yah Sab Hunakti Mahim Imam. To take proper decision at all crucial times, the king has his cabinet of ministers. 3 of them always accompany him. They always are there to advise him in all acts. But if a very important and confidential decision is to be taken in an emergent situation, he should discuss the matter in a cabinet of at least 8 ministers, expert in different aspects of statecraft. There is also a larger body of cabinet for general administration and public welfare, which has 38 members, consists of 4 learned Brahmins, learned in Shastras, 8 brave and chivalrous Kshatriyas, 21 rich merchants from Vaishya community, 3 Shudras from the lowermost social community, and 2 should be Sutas, charioteers, basically the traditional charioteers of the royal family who have served also the father or the grandfather of the king. They know everything about the family because they are so close to the family. Should I proceed or should I, would you please advise me whether it was all right and I should continue?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, please continue, sir.
Continue?
Yeah.
Okay.
You can have 10 more minutes time so that you can give a comprehensive account of what you're going to say. Yeah.
Okay. Now, a little about the character and behavior of the king. As the duties of kingship are ritual acts of dharma, they must be performed in the correct manner by a suitable person. Hence, the Raj Dharma expounds upon the moral character of the king and upon the manner in which he should regard his position. Bhishma announces that he will give 36 qualities. There are 36 qualities of an ideal king, though many of these turn out to be modes of conduct rather than character traits. The picture he presents is that of a paragon of chivalrous virtues, a man who seeks prosperity without harming others, who performs his duties without malice, and who never falls prey to cynicism or atheism. He is heroic without boasting of his prowess, charitable and mighty without being harsh or aggressive. He is loyal to his friends and does his duty without oppression, neither overly violent nor excessively mild. He also gives the meaning of Rajan. He also quotes a sage named Utathya, who explained the word Rajan as Yasmin Dharmam Virajate, one in whom Dharma shines forth. Hence, a king must transcend desire and wrath and never be a victim of pride. He must never keep men of bad character as his associates, and he must give up arrogance, conceit, and anger. When the king is neglectful, natural disasters afflict the realm as a result of his deviance from dharma, and he must always be mindful of his conduct. He should not desire the wealth of others and should give charity at appropriate times. He should be heroic in war, truthful in his speech, and tolerant, keeping his counsels secret and controlling the force of his anger. He must be steady in following the duties imposed on him by Shastra. Shanti Parva thus presents a picture of a monarch as a man of ideal character. He is strong and heroic, yet righteous and not controlled by lust or wrath. The primary duty of such a king is to protect his subject from invaders from outside the realm and from criminals within who seek to plunder the wealth of the innocent. Protecting the weak is the essence of kingship according to the Raj Dharma, and the citizens of the state should be fearless and never have to conceal their wealth. They should live like sons in the house of their father. Because for the king, no other eternal dharma exists but the provision of shelter. This is the very essence, the churned butter of Raj Dharma, and the blessed Brihaspati and all other teachers on this subject praise Raksha, protection of the Praja, protection of his people, as the highest duty of a king. The same is restated by Bhishma in chapter 76 and again in 120. Protection is the most important responsibility for a monarch, and when properly executed is sufficient to carry him to heaven. It is to be extended to all beings and is the focal point of Kshatriya Dharma. The comparison of the subjects in a kingdom to children in the house of their father is used repeatedly, as in the Adhyaya, chapter 57, to illustrate the ideal disposition of a monarch towards those over whom he rules. Just as an expectant mother will give up all what is dear to her for the sake of the child in her womb, so Bhishma asserts a king should make any sacrifice for the sake of the welfare of his subject. Hence, although beggars are often worthless vagabonds and should not be encouraged, the king should provide from his own resources for those who are truly in need. In chapter 78, we find the king Kekai proclaiming himself as a righteous ruler. And to prove his case, he states that he sustains those in need by sharing his wealth with the destitute, the helpless, the elderly, the weak, the poor, and with women, presumably those who have no male guardian to provide for them. In instructing Yudhishthir on how a city should be governed, Bhishma specifies the destitute, the helpless, the elderly, and the widows, Kripanan, Ath, Vardhan, Vidhvanam, Chayushitam, as those for whom the king should always arrange for the provision of maintenance. Utathya, quoted by Bhishma, similarly includes wiping away the tears of the destitute, helpless, and elderly, and bringing happiness to all people in his list of actions that constitute the dharma of the king. The king should also be the dispenser of justice in the kingdom, and in this role, he must be completely impartial, punishing friends and rewarding his opponents if justice dictates such a course. He must be a man of energy and action, not a man of philosophical disposition, who attributes all circumstances to destiny, but one who believes in the efficacy of his own endeavors, guiding the course of events and bringing happiness to the citizens of his domain. The Raj-dharma thus presents the ideal king as a ruler who regards his subjects as a father would his own children, who is always protective, just, and impartial in his dealings, who provides for the needy and is always active in seeking the welfare of his subject. The text also expounds in business practice that brings prosperity to the kingdom as a whole. Certain areas of the economy should apparently be under the direct control of the state, for Bhishma urges that the king should appoint trustworthy men to manage mines, salt making, excise duties, ferry crossings, and the forests where elephants are found. Thus, we have the vision of something of a social contract, a symbiotic relationship between ruler and the ruled. The subject of the state are protected by the military strength of the king, and if they fall into the state of impoverishment, the king is to provide the basic necessities for them. Under royal protection, trade, industry, and agriculture will flourish, and from this economic source, the king may levy a reasonable degree of taxation to finance his army, administration, and personal fortune. His power in the realm is absolute, but his dispensation of authority should ideally be guided by an understanding of duty, dharma, and self-interest, for he is warned that tyrants never prosper. There are certain rules about taxation. If you are interested, I can read it out. The king is advised to use taxation as his means of raising revenue to finance government expenditure. According to Bhishma, he should observe the dealings of merchants and assess their wealth before levying taxes upon them. Similarly, he should note the productiveness, labor, and wealth of the craftsmen and tax them accordingly. In deciding how much an individual must contribute to the treasury, he must take into account the earnings and the labor and set the tax at a reasonable level. For if too high a sum is demanded, no one will be inclined to work hard. Both the king and the laborer must be allowed to benefit from his endeavors, and the ruler must take care not to allow his greed to destroy the root of his prosperity. Merchants and farmers should not be taxed excessively, for farmers carry the burden of sustaining the kingdom, and merchants have to undergo much discomfort in traveling here and there to earn their livelihood. The king should thus take great care in levying taxes, ensuring that his treasury is filled, but without seeking to satisfy his greedy tendencies through taxation that discourages crafts, trade, and agriculture from flourishing. He may on occasion resort to spreading false rumors of war, so that the people will become fearful and hence more inclined to part with their wealth. This is allowed. Economics are not completely laissez-faire, for the king is advised to discourage and restrict practices that are immoral, drinking houses, prostitution and pimping, as well as actors and gamblers. At the same time, he should actively encourage acceptable lands, acceptable practices like pursuit of culture, dramatic performances, and poetic congregations, etc. Bhishma also throws light on apad dharma, on emergent, if some emergent situation arises. What are the rights of a king in the case of emergency if the state is attacked by enemy? The political scenario is sketched above presents a somewhat idyllic view of a monarchical state in which the citizens were protected by righteous potentates whose hegemony is never tyranny because it is restrained by ordinances of Shastra and the advice of wise Brahmins. One's natural suspicion, however, is that the kings at whom the teachings of the epic were directed could not have been untouched by the corrupting influence of the power. Such suspicions are fueled by occasional warnings from the text itself that the king who oppress their subjects are ultimately unsuccessful. The fact that the monarchy depicted in the Raj Dharma is an ideal is made apparent by the section that follows it in the Shanti Parva, known as Apad Dharma, the Dharma for a Kshatriya in distress. In fact, such of the material found in these chapters is at best tangential to this topic, including several lengthy parables similar to those found in Panchatantra and Hitopadesh, as well as general treatises on the subjects of morality. The clearest and most concise exposition of Apad Dharma is actually found in the last chapter of the Raj Dharma, 128, which serves to introduce the following section. The argument presented here urges that in times of emergency, when the position of the king is threatened from within or without, he is entitled to abandon the restraints imposed upon him by Raj Dharma and resort to unrighteous practices, adharma, in his struggle for self-preservation. That is to say, he may become tyrant and oppress his subjects, for a king is both the protector and destroyer of the people. All beings, even the sage in the forest, live off others, and the king is no exception. Therefore, he must sacrifice others in order to preserve himself. To fulfill his treasury and maintain the power of his army, he may oppress the people without incurring any fault. Tadartham pidayitvacha dosham na praptum arhati. Here the mood is very different. There is no idealism regarding royal duties, but instead emphasis on the retention of wealth and power, most notably in Bhishma's teachings in chapter 132. The underlying concept of Apadharma is made clear in the story of Vishwamitra and the famine narrated in chapter 139, in which Vishwamitra was allowed to eat the meat, the foul meat of a dog in order to protect his life.
So I may have to request you to complete the session because we have many questions waiting for you. We have almost received 15 questions up till now. So
Okay. Can I read out the last para?
yes, sir.
The principle on which the Apad Dharma is based is quite simple. Ideally, a king should never be a tyrant and should nurture and protect his people. But when his position is threatened, he may exploit and oppress them in order to secure his own interests. The root of this idea goes back to the fear of social chaos when the power of government is undermined. Even a tyrant is better than no king at all, for when anarchy prevails, everybody suffers. In times of crisis, the first priority is to sustain the monarchy, and the state and all other interests may be sacrificed for this principle. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. And Professor Bala will now conduct the Q&A session.
Yeah, thank you so much, sir, for this wonderful talk that you have given us, which tried to explicate Rajadharma.
Thank you, sir, for the insightful lecture that you gave explaining Rajadharma in Mahabharata, focusing on 70 chapters of Shanti Parvan, the longest Parvan of the epic. In such a short time, you gave the gist of comprehensive topic of Rajadharma for us to explore for further research in light of present situation. And as rightly pointed out, Mahabharata is a living tradition. There is no one single text. There are so many texts available for us to explore the way we want to look at it. So that is why we say it's a text which never has an end. It is always open-ended. So the fluxional colors of Dharma in light of the administrative skills as highlighted in the epic, which Professor G.C. Tripathi pointed out, explicates that Rajadharma in Shanti Parvan is public administration, where adhikara is explained both as right and duty. A beautiful message that emanates, a significant message for today's global world where rights precedes the duty. So here is a tradition which is talking about both going simultaneously. Thank you, Professor Tripathi. Thank you, sir, for sparing time for the Spark webinar series on Mahabharata that we initiated in the month of June. In spite of not keeping that well, you spent so much time addressing all the questions. Thank you once again. Professor Bala, our scholars, Ms. Jayashree, Ms. Anmol, Ms. Megha, Ms. Deepshika, and I all thank all the participants for supporting this series of webinars with your regular participation. And let us say, wonderful attendance each time, as well as following and promoting our social handles. Please continue to do so. We will be sending the feedback form to you on Monday, and we look forward to receiving as possible suggestions as well as comments, and we are open to critical comments also so that we can make our sessions more and more engaging and participatory. Thank you and namaskar to all